Lawson's Landing Highway. 12. November 24th. A woman stands alone in the freezing dark watching the neon lighthouse reflect on the wet pavement. Inside the bustling roadside restaurant, her family raises a glass to a son they believe is a savior, celebrating a victory built entirely on a lie. They think the daughter they exiled years ago is gone, erased from the story forever. They are wrong. The woman in the shadows isn't just a ghost from their past. She is the hostile takeover they never saw coming. Her name is Isla Lawson, and the envelope in her hand is about to turn their feast into a funeral for their legacy. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Let's get into the story. If you had driven past Lawson's Landing that night, you would have seen the warm glow of the neon lighthouse sign reflecting off the wet asphalt, a beacon for every hungry traveler on the interstate. You would have seen the parking lot packed with trucks and sedans the way it always was on a big night, and you probably would have thought it looked like the picture-perfect American success story. Standing there in the dark, shivering slightly in my coat, I watched the customers walking through the double oak doors, laughing, ready for a hot meal. They had no idea that inside that building a war was about to end. They didn't know that the dinner taking place in the private banquet room wasn't a celebration, but an execution. I was about to walk into a room where my family sat waiting to strip me of everything I thought I owned: my title, my control, and my history. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the same girl they had bullied out of town 7 years ago. They thought they were about to erase me. They were wrong. To understand why I was standing in that parking lot with a terrifying envelope in my purse, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand that before I was an enemy, I was just the help. My education didn't start in a lecture hall. It started when I was 10 years old, standing on a milk crate so I could reach the dish pit sprayer. The smell of Lawson's Landing frying bacon, dark roast coffee, and the metallic tang of the flat-top grill was more familiar to me than my own bedroom. While other kids were watching cartoons, my granddad Walt was teaching me how to read order tickets. He would pull me aside during the lunch rush, pointing at the chaos of the kitchen and say, "Look at that Isla. Most people just see plates of food. A real operator sees the system." He taught me that a restaurant wasn't just about cooking. It was a living machine of margins, waste, and timing. He made me feel like I had a special kind of sight, like I was a natural-born operator. But Granddad Walt wasn't the only man in the family. There was my father, Daniel Lawson, the owner by birthright, if not by talent, and my older brother, Nash. Nash was the golden boy, charming, lazy, and perpetually forgiven. The dynamic was set in stone at Sunday dinners. I remember one specific afternoon when I was 12. Granddad Walt was praising me for catching a supplier who had been overcharging us for linen service. I was beaming, feeling like a real part of the business. My father just chuckled, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and said, "She's sharp. She'll make a great waitress wife for some lucky guy one day." Then he clapped a hand on Nash's shoulder. "But this one here, this is the future of Lawson's." I remember the sting of it, hot and sharp. I looked at my mother, Ruth, hoping she would say something correct to acknowledge that I was more than just a future wife. She just looked down at her plate. That was the first time I felt it, the sensation of being minimized, of shrinking in my chair while Nash soaked up the light. It got worse as I got older. By 16, I wasn't just bussing tables. I was analyzing the business. I spent weeks of sleepless nights creating a new rotating menu concept and a social media plan to modernize our razor-thin margins. I bound it in a plastic folder and left it on my father's desk, heart-pounding, waiting for his approval. 3 days later, at an all-staff meeting, my father stood up. "I want to share some fresh ideas Nash came up with," he said. He proceeded to present my entire plan slide by slide, word for word. He praised Nash's vision. The staff clapped. Nash sat there leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, and when our eyes met, he didn't even blink. It felt like they had reached into my chest, pulled out months of my life, and used it to build his pedestal. That was the moment I realized they weren't just ignoring me. They were actively erasing me to keep their narrative clean. When Granddad Walt passed away, the last thread holding me to that place snapped. The funeral was massive. the whole town came out proving that Lawson's Landing was the heart of the community. But when I went back to the restaurant after the wake, I noticed something on the famous history wall in the lobby. The candid photo of me and Walt laughing in the kitchen was gone. In its place hung a glossy stage studio portrait of Nash in a blazer he never wore. It was a quiet, symbolic act of violence. Daniel was rewriting the history of the business to make it look like Nash had always been the heir apparent. The explosion happened a week later. I confronted Daniel in the office. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me with cold, tired eyes and said, "This business isn't for daughters, Isla. It's too hard." Nash chimed in from the corner. "Just stay in your lane, sis." That phrase, "stay in your lane," rang in my ears like a gunshot. I realized then that I could never win this game because the rules were rigged against me. I secretly applied to a business school in the city 3 hours away. When I got in, I asked my father for help with tuition. He refused. He told me that if I left, I was abandoning the family for some corporate fantasy, so I left before dawn with one suitcase and a beat-up Honda. I watched the neon lighthouse sign shrink in my rearview mirror, feeling a mix of crushing grief and terrifying exhilaration. I thought distance would save me. I thought if I ran far enough, the Lawson legacy couldn't hurt me anymore. But I was wrong. Years later, a single email in my corporate inbox would threaten everything I had built and drag me straight back into the story I thought I had escaped. The city didn't care who my grandfather was. That was the first thing I learned, and honestly, it was the greatest relief of my life. In the city, I wasn't Daniel Lawson's daughter or the girl who ran away. I was just a blurred face on the subway, another student grinding through a master's program on caffeine and ambition. I worked 2 jobs to pay my rent, opening shifts at a coffee shop at 500 a.m. and filing paperwork in the campus administration office until sunset. I lived for the anonymity. Here, respect wasn't inherited. It was a transaction. You performed, or you vanished. I decided I would never vanish again. I built a life that had nothing to do with frying bacon or family feuds. I moved in with Jenna Price, a nursing student who treated sleep like a suggestion. She used to tease me when she found me curled up on the sofa on a Friday night analyzing balance sheets for fun. "You're married to spreadsheets, Isla," she'd say, stepping over my piles of textbooks. "It's unnatural." But I had support too. I met Eli Romero, a paramedic in training who had the steadiest hands I'd ever seen. Eli didn't care about my last name or the drama I'd left behind. He admired that I paid my own bills and fixed my own problems. He was grounded in a way my family never was. But the person who truly reshaped me was Dr. Patel, my professor for distressed business management. He was a small man with a terrifying intellect who caught me staring at a case study one afternoon. "You don't just read numbers, Isla," he told me, tapping the page. "You interpret them. Most people see a profit and loss statement. You see the story behind it. That is power. Don't let anyone threaten that." That advice became my armor. By the time I graduated, I landed a job at a regional consulting firm specializing in operational turnarounds. My job was to parachute into failing businesses, trucking companies, mom-and-pop factories, restaurant chains, and figure out why they were bleeding cash. I saw the patterns immediately. I saw legacy owners coasting on nostalgia, refusing to modernize, and keeping bad books. Every time I sat across from a stubborn old man who refused to listen to reason, I saw my father. I got good at saving them from themselves, even when they hated me for it. I was rising fast, building a reputation as a cold, efficient operator. I thought I had completely severed the tie to my past until one late night in October. I was scrolling through a new batch of distressed client leads, scanning for potential projects. My eyes glazed over the names until I froze. There, halfway down the list, was a familiar lighthouse logo, Lawson's Landing. My stomach dropped so hard I gripped the edge of my desk to keep the room from spinning. The internal report was brutal. It labeled the business as a high-risk family operation, likely sale or closure in 12-18 months. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the next line. It noted a prospective buyer was circling a holding company known for bulldozing local landmarks to put up generic highway hotels and franchise burger joints. They weren't just going to buy it, they were going to gut it. The report detailed an over-leveraged mortgage ballooning vendor debts and payroll accounts that were barely clearing. I shouldn't have done it, but I picked up the phone. I called my father. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When I tried to warn him about the debt ratios and the predatory buyer, he laughed. It was a dark, dismissive sound. "You're snooping now, Isla," he asked. "This is just alarmist nonsense from outsiders who don't understand real work. We have a legacy. We're fine." He hung up. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a text from Nash Relax. "Grown-up stuff. Mergers, big boy deals. Don't embarrass yourself pretending you get it." I sat in my dark office, the blue light of the laptop illuminating my rage. The phrase "erase me" echoed in my mind. They weren't just erasing me as a daughter anymore. They were erasing the only person who could see the cliff they were driving off. I thought about the servers who used to slip me extra fries when I was a kid. I thought about the veterans who came in for breakfast every morning. If the Lawson men went down, they would drag the whole town's economy down with them. I could have walked away. They told me I didn't belong. But then I remembered Nash's text. "Grown-up stuff. They told me to stay in my lane. They just never imagined my lane would be hostile acquisition." I stopped crying and started typing. I pulled up public records, county filings, and old partnership agreements from when Granddad Walt founded the place. I spent hours digging through the legal sediment of the company, and then at 3:00 a.m. I found it. A single clause in the original incorporation documents that Walt had added decades ago to protect the minority shareholders. It was a tiny, overlooked detail, a crack in the foundation of their kingdom. But it was enough. If I played this right, I could legally outmaneuver my father and brother without them ever knowing I was in the game. I stared at the screen, a cold resolve settling over me. That one line of legalese was the weapon I needed, and I was about to wedge a crowbar right into it. My grandfather was a sentimental man, but he was also a paranoid one. That paranoia turned out to be my greatest asset. When I dug into the ownership structure, I realized Walt had never actually given my father full control. To protect the restaurant from exactly the kind of ego-driven mistakes Daniel was currently making, Walt had spread the shares like seeds in the wind, distributing them among longtime employees, silent partners, and distant cousins. Daniel had spent decades assuming his loud voice, and the name on the sign meant he owned the place. But in reality, he only held influence, not a mathematical majority. He was a king without a kingdom, and he didn't even know it. I couldn't do this alone, so I brought in Marissa Chu, a sharp-edged corporate lawyer at my firm, who treated hostile takeovers like a sport. We sat in a conference room surrounded by takeout containers, mapping out a strategy that felt less like business and more like an assassination. "We can't just buy them out in your name," Marissa warned, tapping a pen against her teeth. "If Daniel catches wind that his exiled daughter is buying equity, he'll spook and lock down the remaining shares. We need camouflage." We created a series of boring-sounding LLCs, generic holding companies, that looked like dull investment vehicles to quietly accumulate the shares from the small holders my father had ignored for years. "Once you start this," Marissa told me, her eyes serious, "you can't pretend you're just the hurt daughter anymore. This is war." I started with Gloria Bell. Gloria had been the head waitress at Lawson's for 30 years before retiring to a modest apartment on the edge of town. Her tiny percentage of the company was the only investment she had ever owned. When I knocked on her door, she looked tired, but her face lit up when she recognized me. We drank tea and I listened to her talk about the old days. When I finally explained why I was there, that the restaurant was drowning, and I needed her shares to save it, she started to cry. It wasn't about the money. "If anyone can keep this place from turning into a parking lot, it's you, Isla," she whispered, signing the transfer papers with a shaky hand. It became a pattern. I visited a mechanic who had once bartered engine work for equity, a cousin who had moved to Arizona and forgotten he even owned a piece of the business, and the widower of an original partner. None of them cared about squeezing out a profit. They cared about the restaurant as the glue that held the town together. I framed my offer as a way to save their shared legacy, not just a power grab, but alone in my apartment at night, looking at the growing stack of signed transfer forms, I had to be honest with myself. Part of me was doing this for the town, yes. But a darker, sharper part of me was doing it because I was furious. I wanted to strip my father and brother of the right to call me unworthy. I felt the crushing weight of it, revenge tangled up with duty. By mid-November, Marissa ran the numbers. We were agonizingly close. "You're within a few percentage points of a controlling majority," she said. "But you need one more big block." That block belonged to Hank Torres. Hank was the former kitchen manager, a man who had practically raised me in the back of the house until he was forced into early retirement 3 years ago. I found him living in a small rental, his hands permanently scarred from decades at the grill. He tried to slam the door in my face the moment he saw me. He was bitter, hating anything with the name Lawson attached to it. "I'm not here for my father," I said, wedging my foot in the doorframe. "I'm here to fire him." Hank stopped. I sat at his kitchen table and listened to the truth about why he left. It wasn't retirement. He told me how Daniel and Nash had repeatedly ignored his warnings about the ventilation system to save money, leading to a near-fatal grease fire that almost killed a prep cook. Hank had walked out rather than watch someone die. "They don't care about the people inside that building," Hank spat. He signed the papers not for me, and certainly not for the money, but for the workers still trapped in that kitchen. Back in the city, Marissa and I filed the final paperwork on a random Tuesday afternoon. I watched a digital status bar on my screen tick from 99% to 100% complete. And just like that, the math shifted. I owned 52.1% of Lawson's Landing. I felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made me physically ill. I was the majority owner. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was my mother, Ruth. Her voice was unusually warm, a fragile chirp that set my teeth on edge. She was inviting me home for a special Thanksgiving dinner. "Your father wants everyone there," she said. "He has a big announcement to make." I knew exactly what that meant. They were planning to officially crown Nash as the future CEO, or worse, announce the sale to the corporate liquidation firm. I told her I'd be there. I hung up the phone and slipped the document proving my 52.1% ownership into a plain manila envelope. If they wanted a coronation, I would bring the guillotine. As I drove back into town that night, watching the neon lighthouse sign flicker on the horizon, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't the girl they sent away anymore. I was the storm they never saw coming. The Lawson farmhouse had never looked more beautiful or more deceitful than it did that night. The mahogany table was set with the good heirloom china heavy silverware, catching the flicker of a dozen tapered candles. It looked like a glossy magazine spread of the perfect American Thanksgiving, the kind of image that sells a lie of warmth and unity. But as I took my seat, I knew it wasn't a home. It was a stage set. Daniel had curated the audience perfectly. It wasn't just family. He had invited the town pastor, the local bank manager, and a couple of our oldest suppliers. These were the witnesses he needed to validate the lie he was about to tell. The air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey and expensive wine, but underneath I could smell the tension, sharp and metallic. The jabs started before the appetizers were even cleared. My Aunt Linda, who had always echoed my father's opinions like a parrot, leaned across the centerpiece. "It's so good you have your own little life in the city, Isla," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Not everyone is cut out for the burden of real responsibility like Nash is. It takes a certain kind of strength to stay and lead." I watched Nash preen at the head of the table, loosening his tie. He looked the part, handsome, relaxed, completely oblivious to the fact that his leadership was about to bankrupt the legacy he claimed to protect. I quietly clocked every person at the table who nodded in agreement. They had swallowed Daniel's narrative whole, the prodigal son returning to save the town, and the flighty daughter who couldn't hack it. Midway through the main course, Daniel stood up. He tapped a spoon against his wine glass, the high, clear chime cutting through the chatter. He cleared his throat, putting on his benevolent patriarch face. I want to make an announcement. He began, resting a heavy hand on Nash's shoulder. He spoke about sacrifice, about the weight of history, and how the son who stayed was the only one with the vision to carry Lawson's Landing into the future. Then came the twist. He announced a strategic partnership with a corporate group, a sanitized way of saying he was selling the soul of the business to a franchise conglomerate. He framed Nash as the visionary who brokered the deal, calling it a necessary step to protect our town. He was rewriting the impending gutting of our community as a noble act of salvation. I sat there listening to the applause ripple around the table. I heard the phrases echo in my head: sacrifice, real work, the child who stayed. My hands were shaking in my lap, not from fear, but from a cold, blinding clarity. They weren't just sidelining me anymore. They were using this table, this food, and these people to erase me from the story one last time, and they were going to take the entire town down with them. The applause reached a crescendo, and that was the moment the dam broke. I picked up my heavy crystal water glass and set it down on the table with a deliberate, violent thud. The sound killed the room. The applause died instantly. Are you sure you want to tell this story in front of everyone, Dad? I asked. My voice was terrifyingly calm. Daniel's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed into slits. Sit down, Isla, he hissed, the benevolent mask slipping. Don't you dare threaten your brother's moment. I didn't sit. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the manila envelope. I placed it in the center of the table, right between the flickering candles. I'm not threatening him, I said, projecting my voice so the pastor and the banker could hear every syllable. I'm correcting him. I told them exactly what I had been doing for the past 6 months. I told them about the coffee with Gloria Bell, the visits to the mechanic, and the conversation with Hank Torres. I explained that while they were busy polishing Nash's image, I was busy buying the shares of the people they had discarded. Open it, I said. Daniel snatched the envelope. He ripped out the summary sheet, his face flushing red, then draining to a ghostly white as his eyes scanned the bottom line. Isla Lawson, 52.1%. As of last week, I am the controlling owner of Lawson's Landing, I announced. Legally, I decide whether we sell. Legally, I decide who runs this place, and we are not selling. The room erupted. Ruth clutched her pearls, letting out a strangled sob. Someone crossed themselves. Daniel slammed his fist onto the table, shaking the china. You traitor! He screamed, spit flying. You stole this! You stripped us of our birthright! You stripped me of credit for 20 years! I fired back, my voice finally rising to meet his. You stripped Hank of his safety. You tried to erase every worker you were about to toss aside for a check. I didn't steal anything, Dad. I bought it. Nash looked like a child whose balloon had just popped. But I need this, he stammered, his charm dissolving into pathetic dependency. I was promised. I need this title. The throne is gone, Nash, I said coldly. I'm hiring a professional operations manager. The sale is canceled. You're welcome to apply for a shift if you want to do real work, but you're done playing boss. Daniel looked at me with pure hatred. If you do this, he spat, you are no daughter of mine. It was the threat he had held over me my entire life. But looking at him now, a small, angry man losing his grip, it held no power. You've used that threat since I was 10, I said. Turns out I survived just fine without your approval. I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving the chaos behind me, my mother sobbing, Nash shouting at no one, and Daniel raging at a piece of paper. I walked out into the cold night air and stopped at the edge of the driveway. I looked back at the glowing windows, knowing that inside the perfect family was burning to the ground. In one night, I had shattered the story they had built, but as I stood there in the dark, I realized I had no idea what it would cost me once the town chose who to believe. The morning after the dinner, I walked into town to buy a coffee, and the silence was loud enough to rattle my teeth. Conversation stopped the moment I pushed open the door of the bakery. People I had known since kindergarten suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating or whispered behind cupped hands as I passed. It didn't take a genius to figure out why. Nash had been busy. He had spent the night spinning a tale of a greedy city girl who swooped in to steal the family business and break her daddy's heart. The rumor mill was churning out a story where I was the villain who didn't care if local workers lost their jobs as long as I got my payout. I drank my coffee black standing on the sidewalk and let the hostility wash over me. I knew the only way to kill a lie was with the truth, and I had a meeting to run. I called an all-staff meeting in the banquet room at Lawson's Landing that afternoon. The atmosphere was poisonous. The faces staring back at me were stony arms crossed tight against chests. Some of the older waitresses refused to even sit down, standing near the exit like they were ready to bolt. I didn't waste time with warm fuzzies. I set up a portable projector and threw the real numbers up on the screen, the terrifying debt load, the foreclosure warnings, and the impending sale contract Daniel had been hiding. "I didn't come here to be liked," I told them, my voice echoing in the tense room. "I came here because this place was 6 weeks away from becoming a parking lot." I laid out the plan in simple, brutal terms. We were going to implement new safety standards immediately. We were revamping the menu, and if we hit our targets, there would be modest but real raises, not promises, but contracts. A heavy silence followed until an old line cook, a man with forearms like tree trunks, snarled from the back. "Daniel said you were just here to cut hours and bring in outsiders. He said you're a corporate hatchet man." I looked him dead in the eye. "The only thing I'm cutting," I said, pointing to the safety reports, "is the kind of leadership that almost burned this kitchen down 3 years ago because they were too cheap to clean the vents." I promised them I would be on the floor, not hiding in an office. I told them the next year would be hell, but we would survive it together. Trust is a slow build, but I laid the bricks one by one. I installed the long-requested vent hoods within the first week. I replaced the broken dish machine that had been leaking for a decade. I worked double shifts on the weekends, running food and wiping tables until my feet bled, proving I wasn't afraid of the grunt work. I launched a social media campaign highlighting the staff's stories, drawing in highway travelers who wanted a real American diner experience. Slowly, the glare in the kitchen softened. The whispers in town changed tone. One Tuesday, the same cook who had snarled at me slid a plate of fries onto the pass and nodded. "Order up, boss," he grunted. It was the first time the word boss sounded like respect instead of an insult. My biological family didn't take the transition as gracefully. Ruth called me in tears, accusing me of choosing money over blood. "You embarrassed us, Isla," she wept. "You chose business over your family." I held the phone tight, feeling the old guilt try to surface, but I pushed it back. "No, Mom," I said softly. "You chose silence over your daughter for 20 years. I just stopped listening." Nash showed up drunk one night, banging on the back door of the restaurant. He screamed that I had erased him, that I had stolen his life. I went outside and looked at my brother, a man who had never been told no until now. "I didn't erase you, Nash," I told him. "I just took away a title you never earned. Now you have a chance to figure out who you actually are without it." He stared at me, deflated, and walked away into the dark. I refused to let his pain guilt me back into submission. A year later, the numbers told the story. Lawson's Landing was off every distress list. The profits were modest, but the foundation was solid. The debt was being paid. I walked through the lobby and looked at the history wall. I had rearranged it again. Now it displayed a more honest history, photos of Walt, the original prep cooks, the community fundraisers, and right in the center, a picture of teenage me in an apron, grinning over a ledger with my grandfather. The final piece of closure came in the parking lot after a shareholders' meeting. Daniel was there. He looked aged, smaller in his jacket, humbled by watching the results he couldn't deny. He approached me by my car, clearing his throat. "The numbers look good," he said, his voice rough. "The town, they're happy the place is still here." He didn't understand my choices. He probably never would. But he admitted in his own way that he was wrong about my ability. "You saved it," he muttered, looking at the lighthouse sign. I accepted the apology without giving him back an inch of power. That Thanksgiving, I hosted my own dinner at my apartment in the city. It wasn't polished. The table was mismatched, crowded with Jenna, Eli, Marissa, and a few of the Lawson staff who had carpooled up. It was loud, imperfect, and full of people who saw me clearly. Eli raised a toast to courage. Jenna joked that I had speed-ran generational trauma, and won. I looked around the table and realized that family isn't the blood that runs in your veins. It's the people who bleed for you when it counts. Later that night, standing on my balcony, I looked out at the city lights and thought about the girl who had run away with one suitcase. If your family or anyone else tries to define your worth, remember that their narrative doesn't make it true. They can try to erase you, threaten your place, or say you're a sacrifice, but as long as you're breathing, you can choose another ending. My name is Isla Lawson. I was the daughter they tried to erase. And the night they chose that dinner table to crown my brother, I quietly, legally, and unapologetically stripped them of the power to decide who I get to be. That brings us to the end of Isla's journey, a powerful reminder that sometimes the only way to get a seat at the table is to buy the building. If you enjoyed this story of turning the tables, please hit that subscribe button. Let us know below if you think Isla made the right choice. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.